So as we begin to read the portion of Mishpatim, we struck by the opening conjunction. Ve'ela Mishpatim means, and these are the commandments, these are the ordinances. Don't think I opened up the PowerPoint, so I'm not going to be able to share it with you. But we can do it like this, and then it's open. And there you have it. So Mishpatim judgments, here we go. Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim nishnemen. These are the rules, but that's not a literal translation because we all know that ve'ela, that vav, the v, that is a conjunction, and these are. Now in English, it's poor to start with a conjunction, a new section altogether. Unless you're doing it for effect. The English teacher in creative class would have taken out a red pen or a green pen or whatever. And your computer will do that to you as well and say, consider revising, we don't start a message with a conjunction. But here, it's there for a reason. And Rashi puts it very clearly. It's a bit small, but he makes a distinction between when the passage begins with Eila, as in these are, or ve'ela, which is literally and these. The difference is that when it begins simply with, here we go, eila, that cuts off the preceding section from that which it introduces. In other words, this is something new. However, when it says ve'ela, it's used to add something to the former subject, as in, and these are the judgment. These also, whatever it is. And Rashi says the meaning of this is, what is the case with the former commandments? Those are the ones in the previous parasha, Yitro, the Aseret Dibrot, they were given at Sinai, and so too those were given at Sinai. And maybe we'll come back to the rest of the Rashi in a moment. So Rashi links the two portions and says there's a lot of monetary laws that we have in this week's parasha. And then last week we had the Aseret Dibrot. Somehow there is this conception that the Ten Commandments, that's divine. And the rest of the commandments, well, that's the rabbis. So let's just get this clear. The Aseret they brought were divine and that they were delivered. That was just like a précis. It was a concentrate, so to speak. In the Ten Commandments are included all other 613 commandments. That's a tradition we have. Not the other 613, but all of the 613. And we actually have books written, the compositions written, where this is elaborated. It shows how all the asset that they brought actually include within them the 613 Taryag mitzvot. So all commandments are divine. But not only are the commandments divine, but the oral law is as well. And this is what people sometimes get a little bit confused. And we have this kind of crossover between oral law and rabbinic law, which are very, very, very different. So when Moshe went up on Mount Sinai, he received the Torah. It was delivered in two forms. He was given a written text. We end up with that written text in the form of our Torah that we have, the scroll, and the printed books of Chumash and so forth. At the same time, he was also given the interpretation thereof. For example, in the written text it says, you shall put tefillin between your eyes. But we all know that's not where you put it. Why? Because Hashem said, but when I say the words between your eyes, for whatever reason that is, that I'm saying it, I actually mean up here. But right in between your eyes, it's got to be in line with your nose, but it's not literally between your eyes. So there were groups that rejected the oral law. Most famously were the Sadducees, and they were the Karaites. And they said, no, what's written is written, and the rest is of rabbinic origin. We reject it completely. As Orthodox Jews, we believe that what Moshe did on Mount Sinai is receive the written text, not just the Aseret that he brought, but all the rest, which he then painstakingly had to, copy down when he came off the mountain. At the same time, he also got the oral law, which was the interpretation, as I give you the example of tefillin being worn here rather than literally there. There is much more oral law than there is written law. Somehow Moshe managed to cram it all. It says that he spent 40 days and 40 nights. Why do we even talk about the nights? Well, he didn't sleep. The days were for the written Torah, and the nights were for the oral law. So Hashem taught him the text of the Torah during the daytime hours, and then he didn't let him go to sleep at night. Moshe complained. Well, he doesn't complain, but he records this. He says, for 40 days and 40 nights I was there, I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. Why is that relevant? Who can sleep on Mount Sinai? Anyway, because he was actually being explained the interpretation. There is rabbinic law. There is rabbinic law. For example, take Shabbos. So Shabbos has got a big body of rabbinic law, so it's a good example. In the words of the Torah, it says, Lo taseh kol melacha. You shall not do, we translate melacha as work. It's not really work, it's creative work. So that is defined by the oral law as the 39 melachot. Because of juxtaposition to the building of the Mishkan, it was the creative labors required to prepare, and run the service in the Mishkan. And that's how we get the 39 laws of Shabbat. There are, because of the nature of Shabbat, also many rabbinic laws on Shabbat. So, for example, the Torah prohibits traveling outside of your city on Shabbat. And it gives us a measurement, Tchum Shabbat, which equals more or less 4 or 5 miles. Rabbinic law restricts that to 1 mile, 2 kilometers, or somewhere in between there. 2,000 cubits. That's rabbinic law. The rabbis never try to cheat us and tell us, no, that's not what the Torah meant, and no, they said, this is what the Torah said. The Torah says don't go anywhere. The oral law then says to us it is this distance of the 4 parsaot, and then rabbis limited it further because they wanted to keep people away from harm's way. So we have in Shabbat a large body of rabbinic law, oral law, which is the interpretation of written law, and I could give you many examples where it really comes to the fore in your face is when it comes to financial laws. The ones that are in this week's parsha, Mishpatim. There are so many interpretations. The text is so terse, sometimes so unclear that you need, sometimes so confusing and contradictory, that you actually need the oral law to unpack that big time. The laws of damages and torts, those are in a tractate of the Talmud. Do I have one here? No, in the other room. That actually is 3 tomes. Its original name, it was called Nezikin. We're more familiar with Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, and Baba Batra. That's the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. So it was just divided up into, rather than one massive 30-chapter work into 3 books, so it's easier to carry, from the shelf to the table. But it's actually massive. But the actual text in the Torah is minute. So it would have been difficult to include all of that in the text. It definitely wouldn't fit in one parsha. But it's more than that. It's not just a kind of a space limitation. There's actually a lesson included in that statement, brought down from the Medrash Rashi quotes, just as the previous parashas commandments were given at Sinai, so was everything in this next installment, ve'ele, and these are conjoined, the two. Why is that so important? I'll tell you why. Because the laws of Mishpatim, for the most part, laws that deal with financial matters, business matters, damages, torts, etc. All societies have these, but ours differ fundamentally from other sort of financial law systems um, in other cultures, religions, lands. And that is ours are divine. Whereas in other societies, they're man-made, meaning very well-meaning individuals get together and form a constitution and a code of law um, on how a country should be run. And I say well-meaning because they obviously want uh, it to run well. They want to be happy and there to be peace, etc. But it's not absolute. It's not divine, which means there's change. So you'll have countries. Well, let's take a country with some 50 states. And in some states, there's a death penalty, while in others, it is deemed to be totally abhorrent to, execute somebody fatally. No, same land, same constitution. But the founding fathers of the various states created different penal codes that are, and can you say one's wrong and one's better and one's worse? No, I mean there's a lot of debate for example, the death penalty, if it really acts as a deterrent or not, and if it's purely punitive, then that's not really the point. And the jury's still out on, excuse the pun, on whether the death penalty is actually effective, and it's very difficult because you want to compare stats and societies, but of course every state has different kind of people in them, so it's very difficult to measure that, um, you know, and so we don't know. But that's man-made law. Oh, take South Africa as an example, where uh, our very values changed in the last, what is it, 30 years, from one extreme to another, where things that were enshrined in law, separate but equal development group areas, immorality acts, are abhorrent to our current South African society. And we look back and of course, we look at each other, but nobody voted for a Nats. They just got into power, election after election by, just stuffing ballots. I don't know how it happened because everybody, 40 years later is a progressive and couldn't come to terms with what's going on then. But I'm going to say we because I was already in the country since 1986. It's exactly 40 years since we arrived, and yeah, we all lived with apartheid as it was, and maybe there was some discomfort, but it wasn't seen as by the wider society as immoral as it's seen now. How can something change? It's man-made. So we had a bunch of white men coming together and deciding that this was the correct value system. I'm elaborating, but it's very important because we're taking our code of law and we're hooking it onto the Seta Dibrot. And we are saying that the laws as they relate to lost objects and borrowing your fellows or renting your fellows donkey to perform work, etc., and damages that would occur to it, and your liability and all that. All the laws in the Torah are not man-made. They actually come and they hook up to the Ve'ela, to the previous parsha, which is something which undeniably uh, is divine. Oh, did something wrong again. Don't know. But here we have it. It's coming. Yeah, from the beginning again. If this be so, I'm looking at the end of that Rashi. Why is this section dealing with the civil laws placed immediately after that commanding the making of the altar? To tell you that you should seat the Sanhedrin in the vicinity of the temple. So we had the Sanhedrin in what's called the Lishkat Hagazit. Now, this is one of the last verses of last week's Parsha. telling us about building an earthenware uh, earth altar and offering sacrifices on it. And then from there we go to Mishpatim, and we hook the financial laws to it and the courts. So Rashi says, because you actually had to place the highest court of the land had to be placed in the vicinity to the Mizbeach, to the altar. That earthen altar that is being mentioned a few verses before that, and hooked with that conjunction. Where does a highest Sanhedrin that deals with disputes and financial matters and damages and contracts? It sits next to the altar where the divine stuff is happening. On the altar, you're offering sacrifices to Hashem. Talked about the olotecha, the elevation offerings that raise you to the highest levels. Right next there sits the Sanhedrin, and they're connected to tell us that those laws that are being taught in Mishpatim are close to the altar. They're divine and must be treated as such with absolute holiness. I want to share a peculiar medrash that's somehow related to this. It's a medrash that talks about the first verse in that parsha and says, well, this is connected with this verse. So these are the ordinances that you place before them. Says the medrash, this is the meaning of this verse of Solomon. God endowed the king with your judgments, and the king's son with your righteousness. Okay. Now, the only thing we have here is the word mishpatecham, which is the same word as mishpatim. But whoa, like, what's the Medrash doing here? Throwing in a verse that seems to have no connection at all. So here comes Baal HaTurim to the rescue. Baal HaTurim loves Gematria, loves Roshei Tevot, loves all kinds of allegorical stuff. And this is the word ha-mishpatim. You can see it there. It's highlighted in red. Hey, mem, shin, pei, tet, yud, mem. That spells mishpatim. Second word of the parasha. Ve'ela ha-mishpatim. Says the Baal HaTurim, this is an acronym for the following. Hadayan, the judge. Metzuva is commanded. Sheyase pshara, to try to reach a compromise. Terem yase mishpat, before he rules and issues a verdict or judgment. The Dayan, the judge, is obliged to try and achieve a compromise between the two parties, mediate, before arbitrating. So that is very interesting. And it's taken from that first word in the parasha, but it's something which is applied today when two parties come for a dispute before Beis Din. Beis Din will always say, "Can we try and mediate a solution that you'll both be equally happy with or equally unhappy?" Rabbi Kutztag, a former head of the Beis Din, the Dayani, used to always say, when two people come out of the Torah, they must both be very upset. So I don't know. I would think that you have to do it in the way in which both are very upset, and the way to do that is actually to convince them that we ruling you dispute according to the laws of the Torah. So once the Dayanim of the Beis Din have made a ruling, then you fulfilling it, whether you like it or not, you have to be happy about it because you're not doing what the Torah enjoins you to do. That's great. But before we even have a Dayanim kind of come out with a judgment, we wanted to try and do a pshara. So this is what the Talmud says about Moshe and Aaron. Aaron famously was Ohev Shalom, Rodef Shalom. He loved peace, he pursued peace. And his way was always to kind of almost bend the truth somewhat to be able to get to peace. Okay, so he was a mediator par excellence. But then the Medrash says, Moshe Rabbeinu, no way. Moshe Rabbeinu, his approach was let the law pierce the mountain. In other words, the law is the law. As I say here in South Africa, the law is an ass. The law has got to be allowed to proceed irrespective of humans or anything else. Now, very diametrical approaches. But this is the story. You know when you can reach a compromise. Case is put before Dayanim, and the Dayan says, hey, I think we should, try and, make a compromise here. At what point may he no longer suggest a compromise? As soon as, in his head, the conclusion, the judgment has become clear, reaching a compromise at that point would be somewhat disingenuous. He knows what the law says. So he knows that if there's, Reuven and Shimon, as we normally say, or Johnny and Mark sitting there in the court, and Reuven is the one who's going to win the case, but he says, no, we got to make a compromise first. When he knows that Reuven is the winner here, that's dishonest. It's incorrect. So as soon as a Dayan has reached the point where he knows the law, he knows what the judgment, the outcome is going to be here, he can no longer suggest compromise. Do you get where I'm going? How long does it take Moses to get to the verdict? He learned it all from God on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. As soon as the dispute comes before him, even before they finish talking, he knows, what the verdict is. Moshe, because of his nature, because of his mastery of Torah and of Halakha, can never be a mediator. He's got to make a Halakha. The law has got to pierce him out. Aaron, who studied Torah, but not at the level of Moshe, 100% can be the mediator and the man of peace. Coming back to King Solomon, the only other person in our history who had that mastery of the law since Moshe. We got to go back. Lishlomo of Solomon, God, new judgments must go to the king, right? There's no way King Solomon can start doing mediation because his wisdom, which was beyond any other humans, just allowed him to reach a conclusion almost instantly, like Moshe Rabbeinu. King's son, you want to go beyond to David and to others, then they can deal with righteousness. They can deal with what's good, what's tzedek. Quite a fascinating insight into the link up between Tehillim chapter 72 and Shemot chapter 20, linking these two. Is it 21? I'm not sure now. There's also something very interesting. The portion of Yitro acts as a buffer between last week, Yitro, and next week being Terumah. See, at the end of Yitro, we talk about the earthenware, the earth altar. Well, you just made a mount of earth, and on there you can offer sacrifices. That's very modest. It's very simple. It's not complicated, but it's only temporary because really here we get to the stage where in the portion of Teruma, they're going for gifts. Well, as you can see, gold, silver, copper, various fancy materials, and so forth. Yeah. Now you got to give donations and make an elaborate structure for Hashem. So you need a portion of mishpatim in between that tells us financial laws, because you never want to donate to the Holy Temple money which is questionable. So if there was a dispute between you and me about ownership of the money, we're going to apply Torah law. Now it'll be mine or it'll be yours. But I can't keep it and say, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to donate it to charity, and that'll be fine. It doesn't work that way. So before you build a temple for Hashem, in Mishpatim, you need to be able to establish clearly which money is whose and where it goes. And I want to talk briefly and end with a story about Lifneihem, the next word in the parasha. Ela Mishpatim. These are the the statutes that are set before them. So Rashi says on the word lifneihem, it means that when you have a dispute, it must go to bet din. You may not take your dispute to a secular court. We understand why not. Even if the ruling may be the same, secular courts rule according to human wisdom. A bet din rules according to divine justice, and they're completely different. That's why we have this obligation to set it before them. But it's a plural. It's a plural. And some of our rabbis linked that plural before them to the fact that courts shall never comprise of one person. Because when giving rulings, you need to be consultative. And that's a famous verse, chapter Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, where we're told, don't ever judge alone. The only one who may judge alone is the one. There should have been a capital O here. Hashem can judge alone, humans cannot and may not. And I want to end with a famous story I read earlier. Well, if it was famous, then I would have known it before I read it earlier. So it's a story which is not famous to me. Rabbi Menashe of Ilya. And he came into the study of a rabbi, and he watched how this fellow was judging alone, even in cases where it's accepted, particularly financial cases. It's the norm that we have 3 dayanim. He was kind of doing it all by himself, arrogantly. And Rabbi Menashe challenged it. And he said, look at the Mishnah. We don't do that. He says, no, I'm not alone. He says, this is a very, very poor attempt at drawing this with AI, who doesn't know Hebrew very well. But anyway, he says, I rule with my colleagues the Shulchan Aruch, Hoshen Mishpat, that deals with financial matters, and the Talmud, Baba Metzia. Those are my helpers. So Menashe thought for a moment, at the cheek and the arrogance of this youngster who was basically, breaking the law. Oh my gosh, have you made books that open the wrong way? This is really pathetic. There are better, but not free, AI picture drawing things that would have done it better. He says, I rule with the Choshen Mishpat and the Talmud. So the rabbi said to him, that's all good and well. Are you aware of the injunction in the Talmud that is absolutely must, that a judge must be totally familiar with the other judges on his court? Now, you can't sit down in a court unless you know who the other people on your court are. I suggest that you go out there and get yourself proper familiarity with Choshen Mishpat and with the Talmud. At that point, you'll be able to use them as your fellow judges. The story is now even more famous because all of you have heard it. Have a wonderful evening.